Welcome to Heritage at Home. My name is Alicia Victoria and I'm an Extension agent here in Union County. I work at the UT Extension office and we're delighted to present to you today Heritage at Home. This is a partnership between the Union County Heritage Festival Board of Directors as well as the Union County Museum. Today, what we would like to do is provide you with some information about heritage and demonstrate some of those heritage skills that you can view and try out at the comfort of your home. Today, we'll be talking about canning and food preservation. One of the services that the UT Extension office provides here in the Union County community is a source to be used as a resource for you to ask questions about canning. If you have questions about canning, then we have answers. Everything from what equipment to use, recipes that will turn out perfectly every time, as well as if something has happened during the canning process and you're just not quite sure how to move forward, you can call us with those questions as well. First, I would like to talk a little bit about equipment and where you can find recipes. A resource that we provide in the community is that you can call us directly with questions about canning. We can provide those in the form of fact sheets that are free to community members, or we can send those out digitally through email, and we often post them as well on our Facebook page. So I recommend that you follow UT Extension Union County on Facebook. When I say tested recipe, what I mean is a recipe that has been tested in a laboratory to be sure that the internal temperature of that product is getting hot enough so that any bacteria is killed and it will not grow due to the sealing process. It's important to know that even though canning has been passed down from generation to generation, it truly is a heritage art form, but it is also a science. And it's important that we respect a couple scientific properties as we move forward with the canning process so that we can be sure that our final product is safe to eat and will last the longest amount of time with the best quality. A resource to go to for truly tested recipes that have withstood the test of time is the So Easy to Preserve cookbook. This is put out by the University of Georgia Extension, and we can order these through the Extension office here, or you can order it yourself. So feel free to contact us if you're interested in that. We also have a guide about canning foods that's been put together by the University of Tennessee Food Science Department. We ask that you make a $5 donation for this publication just to cover the cost of printing. But this has some of the most asked questions concerning altitude or basic recipes that you can try if you're just getting started with canning. So it's a good one to have available. We also offer canning classes here at the Extension office. We offer these at a very low cost so that you have the ability to can foods at the Extension office with the help of an instructor there to answer any questions that you may have. So if you're interested in canning classes, again, be sure to follow us on social media and pay attention to any announcements in local newspapers. I'd also like to talk about equipment. A tested recipe is very important, but the equipment that you're using is also just as important. Depending on the food that you plan to can will determine the type of equipment that you have available. Now, most of us have seen big metal pots like this before. If not in this color, you've certainly probably seen the traditional blue canning pots. If these were sold to you as a way to can or have been passed down, you've probably got a metal rack that goes inside the canning pot that you can use to lift the jars out and drop the jars back in. These are great pots, but it's important to note that any aluminum pot will not heat properly on a convection cooktop or a glass cooktop. So you want to be mindful of that when you're choosing your equipment. An option that also is very good for first-time canners or for home canning is just a regular metal pot with a good lid. If you're canning small jars like a pint jar or a jelly jar, and you have a metal pot with a good fitting lid, you can use that for canning. The only thing that you need to do to modify this pot is to add some sort of barrier or gasket at the bottom so that the jars are not directly on the bottom of the pot. That's important because it can cause complications in heating the jars. It can cause them to move around and shake. It can lead to shattered jars. So you want to have a good gasket in the bottom. There are safe ways to do it by rolling up towels to put in the bottom of the pot, or even using the top of your ceiling rings and putting these evenly spaced on the bottom. Fortunately, as canning has become more popular and we've learned more about how to can safely at home, items like this rubber gasket have been developed where you can just pop it on the bottom of any pot and then you can use it as a canner. Now, while these options are very good and very cheap, there are other options. Specifically, if you have a glass cooktop, it's important to note that you want to check the manufacturer guidelines of your cooktop. Some cooktops just cannot handle the weight of a heavy pot filled with water, filled with glass jars. And the last thing we want to do is shatter our cooktop while we're learning how to can. So if you need another option, there is an option that recently came out. It was created by Ball Preservation Company. It has a nice lid that's sturdy and fits well. This is an electric water bath canner. So what that means is that we have a cord that can actually be plugged into the heating unit on the bottom and then plugs into the wall in your kitchen so that you do not have to have a cooktop to water bath can foods. The thing that makes this a safe option for canning foods is that it has a diffuser rack. We have a rack in the bottom that creates a barrier so that the jars are not directly on the bottom of the pot, and that's important for the reasons I previously mentioned. But this diffuser rack is important because what you do is you actually put it on top of the jars that have been added to the canner. And this diffuser rack helps to circulate heat within the canner. It helps to move the boiling water around the jars. And this has been laboratory tested to be certain that the internal temperature of the canned goods are getting high enough to kill any bacteria. Now, as far as functionality, it's also really great because there's a spout that you plug while you're using it. But once you're done and your water has cooled, if you position this in your kitchen next to your sink, you can unplug that spout and you can actually put the water directly back into the sink. This is advertised as a water bath canner and multi-cooker because due to the functionality, it can also be used for soups or even for hot beverages, which again makes that spout pretty handy. But the important thing to remember is that this is designed as an electric canner. If you have questions about if the equipment that you're using is safe for the recipe that you're using, just give the Extension office a call and we'll be happy to talk it through with you. There are really about 4 main ways that you can can foods, and this is where some of the scientific principles of canning come into play. Water bath canning, which this equipment can be used for, is one of the easiest ways to get started. Water bath canning can be used for high acid content foods. Many fruits are high acid content, but I'll tell you what you see in tested recipes is that additional ingredients are added to increase the acidity of the food. That may be in the form of lemon juice or vinegar, but by increasing the acidity of the canned item, then we can ensure that bacteria has a less likely chance of growing. It also creates the opportunity for us to water bath can these items. What we're doing in that process is we're creating the product and then we're water bath canning it to kill any bacteria that could have been introduced as we were preparing the recipe. You can also can foods with pressure canning. That is going to be specifically used for low acid foods, things like green beans, and I'll tell you, even tomatoes. If you do not want to water bath can tomatoes for 15 or 20 minutes, you can actually pressure can those tomatoes for only 5 minutes. So it may help to maintain the integrity of the tomato, and you may choose to do that for some of your recipes. Because it is pressure canned, the internal temperature is increased to a higher temperature much quicker, and so we can ensure that that bacteria has been killed. With jams and jellies or pickles, sugar and salt are really going to help to decrease the likelihood that bacteria will grow over time. So with pickles and jams and jellies, as long as you are following a tested recipe from research-based institutions, then you can be assured that by water bath canning those items, your product is going to be safe to consume. With jams and jellies, the main component is going to be sugar. That's the part we all know and love, but there's an important science component when it comes to food preservation. Sugar is used as a way to decrease bacterial growth, so the sugar is very important. This is where using a tested recipe, again, it's reiterated over and over, because with a tested recipe, you're going to have a specific amount of sugar that will allow for that bacterial growth to not take place for a certain period of time. If you're interested in learning more about canning and preserving foods with sugar substitutes, there are recipes for that that have been tested, but it's very important that you use certain artificial sweeteners in a specific way. So again, if you have questions about how to do that, feel free to contact your local extension office. Today I'd like to demonstrate traditional apple butter with regular sugar. I don't know about you guys, but this for me is something that I just automatically connect with heritage. When I think of the Heritage Festival, I think of apple butter. What we've done to begin to prepare our apple butter is we have peeled, cored, cooked with water, and made a pulp out of our apples. The next step is to add lots of sugar and more sugar, and to incorporate spices. Cinnamon and cloves are traditionally used in apple butter. What you're going to do is you're going to cook this over low heat until it's all been combined and begins to simmer. And you're going to continue to simmer it until it will hold mounded on the spoon. Let me show you that now. After simmering that combination of crushed apples with water, sugar, and cinnamon and cloves, you're going to cook for about 15 minutes at a simmer, and what you're going to end up with is an apple butter that is thicker and that when put on a spoon will maintain a mound. This means that it's thickened up enough. If it becomes too thick, it's okay to add a little bit more water or some apple juice to the mixture to thin it back out. You're looking for a consistency that will mound on the spoon, but is not so firm like a pudding would be. Once you've reached this consistency, that means we're ready to can. So let's talk about canning jar preparation. Now that we're ready to put this apple butter into jars, let's talk about preparing your jars, lids, and rings for canning. It's important to have the jars slightly heated so that when we add a hot product to the jar, it doesn't shatter or cause any cracks in the jar. The way that we do that is by either putting the jar into a warm water bath, like your water bath canner, or you can put it in the oven on 200 degrees just to keep the jars slightly warm. You don't want them so hot that you can't handle them, and you do want to be careful when removing them from the oven, but having a warm jar to put a warm product into will prevent any unexpected cracks or breaking. When you're ready to begin putting the product into the jars, it's important to note that your recipe is going to give you a specific headspace to follow. The headspace is the very top of the jar. It's typically going to be about 1/4 to 1/2 of an inch thickness. That small amount of space is part of using a tested recipe. That small amount of space has been tested to be not too much space for bacteria to grow in, but just enough space that your product can move around in the canner and not boil product out into your canner. So let's talk about how to put your product into your jars safely. The first thing you want to do is use a funnel. This can be really helpful just to keep your jars clean. As you add your product into your jars, you want to be sure that you're not packing the product in by pressing it down. You're going to gently allow the product to fall in. You may choose to shake your jar slightly or move your funnel around. After the product has been added to the jar, the next thing you need to do is debubble the jar. You can use any small flexible item like a rubber spatula or a debubbler that comes with a canning kit, or even a plastic knife or a butter knife. You want to run this around the outsides of the jar just to be sure that any air bubbles can escape. It's good to get all the way down to the sides, being careful not to let your product bubble over. Once you've filled and debubbled your jars, you've now reached the point where we're adding lids and rings. We want the space that we're adding the lid to be as clean as possible. So you can use a damp washcloth to simply wipe around the edge. Part of most canning kits is a small magnetic wand that you can use to pull your lids out of warm water. It's important to put the lids into warm water. You don't have to put the rings into water. The main purpose of putting lids in warm water is so that the sealant around the outside can be warmed and create a good seal with the jar. It's important that when you're preparing your lids to inspect the outside sealant and be sure that there's no cracks or debris. You also only want to use lids one time. They're used for one canning season. After the wax has been used one time, it's good for the recommended amount that you can find on the package, but you do not want to wash and reuse lids from year to year, specifically because the sealant needs to be fresh. These magnetic wands are great because they allow you to get a good connection between the jar and the lid, and then you add your ring. When adding the ring, you want to get fingertip tightness. You can do this by tightening and then slightly loosening. It's important to have fingertip tightness rather than a very tight lid because as your jars are processing in your water bath canner, air will escape from the jar. That actually helps to decrease bacterial growth, but if the lids are too tight, what can happen is the jars can explode inside the canner. So we want to be sure that we create a little bit of wiggle room for air to escape the sealant and then the product not to boil over. To load your jars into your canner, it's helpful to have a jar lifter. There's a specific order that you want to follow when you're loading jars into a water bath canner. The first thing you want to do after filling your product is be sure that your water is close to boiling but has not started boiling. You want to load jars into the canner when the water is warm. If you see some residue floating in your canner, don't be alarmed. Typically, this is a reaction between the metal, and it will not harm your canned product as long as you washed the canner before using. Be sure that you have a rack on the bottom of the canner so that the jars are not directly touching the bottom of the canner. And we want to slowly add the jars, being careful not to tip them sideways. It's important to put the jars on a secure surface where they won't rock back and forth. If you don't feel like the bottom rack in your canner is secure, stop adding your jars, let your water cool, and move it around to be sure that it's secure. Once loading the jars into the canner, you want the water to be 1 to 2 inches above the lids of the jars. In most cases, unless you've canned for a very long time, it's hard to eyeball that and get it right. So it's a good idea to always have on hand some warm water to add to your canner to be sure that the water level is 1 to 2 inches above the jars. After adding water, to be sure that your water level is 1 to 2 inches above the jars, if you're using an electric water bath canner, remember the reason that this is safe to use is because of this diffuser rack. So we want to be sure that we put that on top of the jars. If you're using a regular water bath canner, then you don't have a rack to add to the top. You just want to add your lid. The next step in the process is to let the water come to a full rolling boil. You want to have a timer on hand, ready to go, because as soon as the water begins to boil, that's when you want to start your timer. For this recipe, we process these jars for 15 minutes. So as soon as we start to see the water boiling, we'll start our timer for 15 minutes and process for a full 15-minute time period. If you're using a water bath canner, that just looks like the water boiling on the stove. If you're using this electric water bath canner, you want to move the dial from high to canning once the water begins to boil. Now, after loading your jars into the canner, you let the canner come to a full rolling boil. After the canner has come to a full rolling boil, you can start your timer for the amount of processing time in your recipe. For our apple butter today, that was 15 minutes. After the jars have processed in boiling water for 15 minutes, your next step is to remove the lid, Be sure to open it away from your body so that any steam can escape without hurting you. And you're going to allow the steam to escape for a full 5 minutes. If you're using a stovetop water bath canner, then you can just turn your stove off. If you're using one of these electric water bath canners, you want to be sure that you've turned the dial all the way to off and allow 5 minutes time for any steam to evaporate and the water to cool down slightly. After that 5-minute period, you can remove your diffuser tray. It's important when you're removing the jars from the canner to use this tool. Can be helpful to remove the jars safely. There are other methods as well, but these are very cheap and come in canning kits, and they get a good grip on the jars. You want to be sure that as you're lifting the jars out of the canner, you do not tilt them in any way. I don't know about you guys, but this is a hard habit for me to break. I always wanted to tilt the jar to the side when I was a kid to get that water off the top. That's not necessary. It actually can do more harm than good, because again, the whole point of that fingertip tight seal that we created is that our seals, our lids, can still move around slightly. So if we tilt our jars in any way, that could cause us to slightly move the lid and create an opening where the seal does not connect well. One thing you may not know about canning is that the processing of the jars is to be sure that the internal temperature of the product is heated to a high enough temperature to kill any bacteria that may have been introduced as we were cooking our recipe and filling our jars. At this point, our jars are still not sealed. And that's a tricky thing to remember, even for myself. In order for our jars to seal, that sealant around the outside of the lid that we heated and placed on our jars, this sealant has to now cool back down completely. It's that cooling of the seal that actually seals our jar. So once removing your jars from the canner, you want to put them in a place on your countertop or your kitchen on top of a towel or rag where you do not touch them. Some of these lids may already be where the vacuum has pulled the button down. And that's great, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are sealed. It just means that the heat and the vacuum created during processing has pulled the button down. We cannot know if our jars have processed correctly and are sealed correctly until they're fully cooled. So leave these jars by themselves. Don't touch them, even though it's tempting, for 24 hours. In 24 hours, you can check your seals, be sure that you have a good tight seal and that all of the buttons are down. As your jars cool, you may hear that sound of the jars being pulled in and that button on the top going down. That just means that that seal has created a vacuum and that it's safe to be shelf stable. Now that your jars have been left undisturbed for 12 to 24 hours, you want to be sure that they've sealed properly. The first thing you want to do is actually take the ring off of the jar and be sure that you don't see any areas where there's debris. You want to check the top of the lid to be sure that it does not flex back and forth and that the button is down to ensure that it's sealed correctly. And you want to inspect the headspace. You can store your canned goods on the shelf for up to 18 months. It's best to store them without the rings so that you can inspect the headspace regularly to check for any mold, yeast, or bacterial growth. If you're giving your canned good as a gift, you can take a small square of fabric and twist the ring back on so that it presents well. It's important to note that you can reuse your rings from year to year, but you want to take them off the jar and keep them in a dry place so that they do not become rusted. Inspect them every year to be sure that they're not rusted and free of debris. However, the lids that are on the top of your jar, you want to replace those every year and use fresh lids. In order for the sealant to work best, you want to use them as soon as possible after purchasing. However, check your manufacturer's guidelines. Some lids can be used up to 18 months and the sealant is still good. However, after sealing on the jar, you want to dispose of these when you're opening a jar up for the first time. Another tip to be sure that you're using it in an appropriate period of time is to date the lid. You want to put the month and the year that you've canned the product. If you're giving as a gift, they even make labels that you can write the month and day that you've preserved the product. It is okay to stack jars on top of each other as long as you have appropriate shelf space and there's no chance that the jars will fall or become broken. If you have any questions about food preservation, recipes, or how to store your canned goods, call your local extension office.